very significant breaking news coming from the world of cricket, which is that Chris Silverwood has been sacked as England head coach. It comes in the wake of their Ashes humiliation, losing 4-0 in Australia, but plenty of other results that didn't go England's way over the course of the last year, where they've lost more Test matches than ever before, losing home and away against India, losing a series against New Zealand as well, and of course the Ashes, and a number of decisions that have contributed this. Ultimately, some of the decisions, such as omitting both James Anderson and Stuart Broad from the first Test in Brisbane, not selecting Jack Leach in the second Test. Of course, not all his fault, as it were, but following the dismissal of Ashley Giles as the ECB's managing director yesterday, there was, of course, huge speculation over the future of Chris Silverwood, and now it has been decided that he will no longer continue in his position as head coach. We spoke to the likes of Rob Key, Nick Compton, Nasser Hussain yesterday, and of course the question is, will it be one head coach that replaces Chris Silverwood, or will indeed it be more than one, because you could split between red ball and white ball cricket, and indeed what has prompted this decision is really England's failure in red ball cricket. They are currently bottom of the World Test Championship, beneath the likes of Bangladesh and also the West Indies, and of course they've got a tour against the West Indies coming up very, very soon indeed. And as far as I suppose, holding the fort for the time being, we know that Sir Andrew Strauss has taken sort of interim charge after Giles' sacking yesterday. Well, now Silverwood has gone too. So more on this as we get it here. And let's just, in fact, speak to James Cole, who's joined us here on set. I've given the sort of basic details of this story, James, but, I mean, ultimately, it doesn't come as a huge surprise, does it, Chris Silverwood's departure?
No, this was inevitable, particularly after Ashley Giles left yesterday. Giles appointed Silverwood. Not only did he appoint him, but he also gave him extra powers of selection, which, as you mentioned there in Australia, England didn't make good selection decisions. So, yeah, it was a matter of time, really, when, not if, Chris Silverwood went. You mentioned his record, 1 win in 14 tests. The Ashes series was one of the most one-sided Ashes series in modern history. 4-0. I mean, it doesn't really tell the story, does it? England didn't get over 300 once batting. They then succumbed to, in Hobart, they were bowled out for 68. There were poor selection decisions. Stuart Broad not playing in Brisbane on a green top. There were dropped catches, there were missed run-out opportunities, there were wickets off no balls, and it all came after an awful 2021 a year in itself, where England, they lost in India, they lost at home against New Zealand, and then they were losing the series against India again here before India didn't play that final test at Old Trafford, so that was 2-1 not completed. But yeah, inevitable, really. His position had become untenable. As you mentioned now, where do we go? Well, the suggestion is that Andrew Strauss, who is head of the Cricket Committee, has presented his thoughts, his findings to the board. He suggested split roles. So what they're going to have to do, because this West Indies series is pending, and England fly out, I think, February the 24th, somewhere around then. The first test, I believe, is the 8th of March. So they're going to have to appoint an interim test coach for that role. Leading candidates for that in the interim would be Paul Collingwood, who led the team in the 2020s in the West Indies recently. Alex Stewart has been mentioned, but he's a director of cricket rather than a coach at Surrey. And another name that's been mentioned as well, interestingly, is the under-19s coach, Richard Dawson, who's currently in the Caribbean coaching the under-19s England team at the World Cup. So that might work potentially as well. But then in the longer term, they've got to look for 2 new coaches. And that would happen between between the West Indies Test series, and then the next series is June, New Zealand in England. So there's a bit of time there where they can start looking for these permanent coaches, if indeed they go down that route of 2 separate coaches. I
mentioned before that sort of wider context of this decision is perhaps not fair to put all the fault at the door of Chris Silverwood. Sure, he's the head coach, and you have to point the finger to a certain extent, but it seems like actually there's a lot of scrutiny, not just on him, there has been scrutiny of Joe Root, and also of the English game as a whole, and how England couldn't score 300 once in 10 attempts in Australia. So, that's something that surely is also going to be looked at whilst they consider who will be that figurehead with the Test team.
Absolutely. There are mitigating circumstances, aren't there? Not least COVID. So there were no proper warm-up games in Australia. There haven't been proper warm-up games in Test cricket all year. Now, Chris Silverwood would have pointed to that, the fact that they had this rotation policy to look after player welfare because they're spending a lot of time in the bubbles. Also injuries, no Josh Archer, no Ollie Stone, etc., etc., etc. But ultimately, when you lose an Ashes series like that in Australia and you have a record of 1 win in 14 tests, the buck has to stop with the head coach, and that's what's happened. And you mentioned too about the structure. Yes, the review of Red Bull Cricket is ongoing. The ECB will look into restructuring Red Bull Cricket. How can they make that better for creating test players?
I mean, ultimately, as far as especially batters are concerned, because we're talking about really batting failures and the fact that playing in English conditions, it's kind of stacked in the bowlers' favours, partly because of when those matches are played in the calendar year, right?
Yes, and part of that was COVID because they restructured the county championship season, and the 100 came along, so you were playing the county championship in the poorest conditions of the summer. That's changed a little bit this season with a few more games being played in midsummer, and there's going to be more changes, I suspect, going forward in that respect. And yeah, you're right. It's not just about clicking your fingers, changing the guys at the top. It doesn't just produce immediate results, but equally, I think, given what has happened in the last year, and yes, there's absolutely mitigating circumstances with COVID, but Ashley Giles' position was dodgy, and when he left yesterday, Chris Silverwood's became untenable. Now, though, the candidates for the job going forward, we're looking at Justin Langer with Australia, but his contract's up this year, potentially.
Gary Kirsten has
he went
his
for the job.
desire to have this job.
He's thrown his hat into the ring.
I feel like he's pitched quite hard for it in past.
He has.
And in recent, a Wisden interview that he did not so long ago, James, he was essentially, it felt like it was a pitch for the vacancy that wasn't there yet. But
while Chris Silverwood was still in the job. Whether that works favourably, I don't know. He went for the job in 2015 and 2019, Kirsten. Didn't get it. But yeah, you're right. He's expressed an interest. There's Mickey Arthur, the former Australia, South Africa, Pakistan, Sri Lanka coach. But he's just joined Derbyshire. So I don't know whether he'd be available. But if you're looking for red and white ball coaches, you've got twice as big a job, haven't you? And we talk about just clicking your fingers and changing the coaches. Well, England used to have red and white ball coaches. Ashley Giles was England's white ball coach not that long ago, and he was always a big advocate of having a red and white ball coach. So it almost feels like we're going around in circles, essentially. But yeah, change had to happen, didn't it?
Yeah.